to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Lisa Stringfellow. Lisa, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Jen, for having me.
I am so glad you are here. And I would love for you to start with, how did you get into writing?
I am a teacher, an English teacher, actually. And so I, have always loved to write and teach writing. And I didn't start thinking seriously about being an author, though, until I went back to graduate school about maybe 15 years ago and was taking different classes on, writing for children or adolescent writing. So it's writing books for kids. And I just was fascinated and thinking, I might like to do this. I'd love to have a book that students would love to read, kids, in the middle grade readers would love to read. And so I started working on it. And that was kind of like the impetus. It took a while to get something that to learn that craft and develop. But yeah, that was the thing. I just really have always loved books, always loved writing, and but being a teacher, I've seen so many wonderful stories, and I started thinking about, well, I might have a story or two that I might like to tell, and so that was kind of my start.
I love that. And because you teach middle school and then you wanted to write for middle school for this grade area, I think that that's just so beautiful. I love that so much. And I love that you teach English. So it's kind of like a nice natural evolution of what you're all about, what you're interested in. I think that's awesome.
Yes, it's fun, and I think it's interesting for my students now that my book is out, that they kind of can see like what it takes for something to go from an idea to an actual book on the shelf. And I share a lot of like that, my publishing journey with them, so kind of firsthand knowledge from an early age for them on what it takes to be an author.
Oh my gosh, that is phenomenal. What a wonderful experience for your students. So, to your point about idea to real life to making it a reality, what was that journey like for you with this first book?
Yeah, so my debut book is A Comb of Wishes. It's a middle grade fantasy about a girl who finds a mermaid's comb and makes a wish. But magic has consequences and costs, and things don't quite go the way that she would have anticipated them to go. And so I wrote the first draft of that back in 2013. One of the things that I do with my students is the NaNoWriMo Young Writers Program. So NaNoWriMo is National Novel Writing Month, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. And but the Young Writers Program lets kids in K through 12 write novels in November, but they can, choose their own personal word goal, kind of unlike us adults who we have to shoot for that 50,000 words in the month of November. But I told my students I would write along with them. So I started thinking about what kind of story I would write, because I committed myself that if I were going to ask them to do something, I was going to do it with them. And I thought about some books that I had read recently. One was a book called The Tale of Emily Windsnap, which was about a seventh grader who discovers that she's part mermaid. And the other book at the same time was Coraline by Neil Gaiman, which is kind of a totally different story, kind of creepy, but basically about a girl who kind of goes on this adventure to save her family and has to be brave. And so I kind of thought about, what if I wrote a mermaid story, but it was a little bit, had some scary moments in it. And the mermaid would be a Black mermaid, because that was something I had not seen and would have loved when I was a kid, and I used to read fantasies. That was my favorite genre. And I set it in the Caribbean because that's part of my heritage. So that just seemed like a natural place for a mermaid to be. And so I started that in 2013, and I won NaNoWriMo that year. So I got to my 50,000 words, but they were pretty bad, as most first drafts are. And so I kept working on it, and I started revising, and I finished the novel, because that was one thing, it's hard to finish a draft in a month. You can get to a certain number of words. But I finished it the next year, started working on the revision, started trying to learn more about writing craft, because that was still early in my journey. Teaching writing and writing professionally is a little bit different. I kind of think about it like athletics and sports. Being a soccer player is different than being like a spectator in the stands. And so I kind of, you might know the game, but like actually getting out and playing it is a little bit different. And so I felt like that I had to learn some things about writing now that I was actually doing it myself. And then I, revised with the help of mentors and with some critique partners, eventually queried it. And in 2019, my agent and I sent it out on submission. And it was picked up by HarperCollins, Quill Tree Books, and just came out this past February. So a bit of a journey from 2013 to 2022, but definitely rewarding. And I'm excited that it's out there for people to read now.
I love all of that. There are so many nuggets that I would love to like go into with you. One of which is your point about saying it's one thing to get it started, it's another thing to finish it, to get that draft finished, and to be okay with the first draft not being that great, whatever that is. If it's just your own expectation, saying, I expected better writing from myself this first go around, taking the pressure off and saying, hey, you did it. You can always go back and revise and edit and strengthen it. And it sounds like one of the ways you went about that was not just learning and reading craft books and honing it from that angle, but working with critique and getting feedback. Could you talk a little bit more about that process of refining, if you will?
Yeah, definitely. And I am definitely a person who loves revision, I think, more than the drafting stage. And sometimes even with my students, they're starting a new piece today, and it's hard. And I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be good. You don't even have to start at the beginning. If it's easier to start someplace else and then kind of work around, write the part that you feel comfortable writing first and go back, it's okay. There are no rules with any of that. So I definitely, once I started writing the story, I found that revising was something I enjoyed, but I did get stuck in that rut, which I think is pretty common, of polishing the beginning and never quite getting to the end. And so that took a little bit of, just work and realizing and advice from other writers that, you can't publish something that's not finished. So go ahead and just get to the end, maybe put the revising on hold until you can get to that end, even if it's not, beautiful and perfect, it's something, and then you can work on improving it. One of the things I did, I had some wonderful critique groups that I was a part of, an in-person group. And then later when I moved, I also would take online classes where there was a critique portion to them. And that was really helpful because, you're inside your own head when you're writing sometimes, and the story, but nobody else does. So they only see what's on the page. And so having other people say, I really, enjoyed this part, but, I didn't really know what the character was feeling, or, maybe the order of something didn't make sense, or have you thought of this? Those were just helpful suggestions that you only get by sharing your work with other people. And I also found that sometimes people, they pushed me in good ways to think about things in a different way than maybe I had been thinking. One of the things was there's so many first versions of the first chapter of my book. It's gone a lot of different directions. But I had a person who said, oh, you should have a, underwater scene, a diving scene. And I was like, nah, that sounds great, but no, I don't think I need that. And they kept saying it, I think it would be really great. And then I was like, okay, fine. And I wrote it, and it was one of my favorite scenes. And it was actually a wonderful scene. It actually used to be in the beginning, and now it's in the end of my current manuscript. So that's a whole different thing about, like, the revision process and where things belong in a final or later version of a story. But another thing that came up was in my story, the main character collects sea glass, and there's a whole thematic connection between sea glass and mermaids that wasn't in my original manuscript. And that came up because a writer in a class that I was in read the manuscript and happened to also be a marine biologist. So she had a science background and said, oh, this is so great, but I don't know if you know this, but collecting seashells is somewhat damaging for the environment. It can cause erosion, and there are a lot of places where people over collect, and it takes away habitat for animals. And I had never heard that before, and so I was like, well, gosh, I don't want to promote that or encourage it by having kids read this book and wanting to do what the main character does. And so I thought, well, what else could she collect that's related, that would be on the beach? And that was when I thought of sea glass, which is basically trash, that glass has gone into the water and it's got kicked around, and then it comes back and it's this beautiful material that people can work with. But what I found out after I made the change was there's a whole folklore around sea glass related to mermaids, and that sea glass, one of the names for it is mermaid's tears. And so it opened an opportunity for like a deeper connection and a more story related things that I could do by having listened to that tiny bit of feedback that someone gave me, and being open-minded to think about, well, maybe I'll explore that a little bit. So lots of great things that can come from even just building your confidence, sharing your work, and getting other people's opinions.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I love that so much. So to your point about sharing and getting feedback, when you do get, sometimes you can still get, like, to your point, you got this feedback about, hey, there should be this underwater scene, and initially you were like, I don't think this works right now. And it's totally okay to make that decision too, to say, not now. Now, to your point, you also said, well, let me try it. Let me go ahead and just give it a chance. But it's still just as important to be able to say, this might not be the thing I need to do at this time. So how did you discern between when to pursue something and when to say, yeah, this really isn't feeling right? I appreciate the feedback, but this isn't necessarily the direction I want to go, and I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, I have a moment like that, and I don't want to give spoilers for the book, but the ending of the book changed at least 3 different times. And one of the changes was, I think it was maybe the second version of the ending, was my agent was suggesting that I have a certain thing happen with the family. And I was like, no, I don't want that to happen. And again, finally, the same thing. I was like, okay, I'll try it. Tried it, and it worked, and it was okay, but I still kind of had, mixed feelings a little bit about it. But the novel was in good enough shape that we were ready to go on submission. And so we did. And when I spoke with the editors that were considering acquiring it, almost all of them, we had a conversation about the end of the book. And the editor that I ended up being acquired by, that was one of the first things that she brought up was, what's your feeling about the ending? And I said, well, it's actually changed a few times, and I'm not sure that I'm totally in love with it. And she's like, okay, because I'm like, I'm not sure that it's the right ending for different reasons. And I said, well, can I tell you what the previous endings were? And we had such a good conversation. And actually what we ended up doing was going back to one of the first ending, actually, that I had written. And the thing that's interesting about that, though, that connects to revision, is that the first ending was changed because one of the characters, in my mermaid, is kind of a dangerous character. And the way the ending was, it kind of made, it felt like it didn't work because the character, we didn't know enough about her. She was just very surface level. And so over the course of all of the endings, or all of the revisions that I made, I added a lot more depth and background to the mermaid character. And so the ending that I felt like didn't work in my earlier draft wasn't so much that it wasn't the right ending, but the novel needed some other work. And so when we put that old ending back with all of these other changes that had been made, and of course some changes to the ending, it's now, I feel like, and the perfect ending. And it wasn't the ending, it was the character and the things, all of the work around this, the building up to this that needed work. And so that was an interesting thing to think about too.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you just described that, to the beauty of revising, the beauty of how feedback helps to craft and you keep coming back. And it sounds like also what you're describing to me is the way to incorporate feedback. Like you started with one group and wove in feedback, refined, worked, you're further along in the journey, you're further along with the manuscript to feel like it's a stronger draft, a stronger story. So you're getting additional feedback from different people to kind of help further hone, and different people meaning the agents, the editors, and so forth, as you're progressing to get this book published. I think that's just phenomenal how it sounds like the ebbing and flowing of this story, just speak in water terms too. And, but I love that. I love that so much. I think that's just beautiful. That is
Thank
so
you.
exciting.
And I think that the benefit and the beauty of different readers is that they can bring different perspectives. I happened to, in that process of before I was agented, had applied to two different mentorship programs and happened to get into both of them, which was amazing. But the thing that was so good about that was that one of the mentors was a middle grade writer. And so when she read my manuscript, she gave me a lot of feedback about voice and would say things like, is this a word that a 12-year-old would use? Is this the way that a 12-year-old would think? And the other mentor was a YA writer who her books just were more fast-paced and action. So she had lots of feedback for me on pacing and on the character development. And so again, both wonderful writers and great feedback, but different and more tailored towards what they were really good at that helped me. So that's also such a useful thing to think about when you're looking for other people to read your work.
Yeah, I love that, because to your point, there were two different expertise, really, two different focuses, but in the same way, the same breath, that those came together to help you hone, and you were discerning, I see how this is making sense, and you're putting the pieces together. Really, you're getting feedback for different things and putting the pieces together in the manuscript itself. So yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely, that is so awesome. So what was it like to, well, I think it's awesome that you've been traditionally published. I think that that is such a wonderful accomplishment. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some tips or some suggestions for how to go about successfully querying. So for instance, do you have some tips on a strong query letter, or just that process? Because sometimes you can query and you might not get somebody who says, yes, I'd be interested, or further along. So do you have any words of encouragement there?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and I definitely had you know, a wonderful query experience. I did not end up sending out tons of letters, which I know, which is, I think there's just so many different ways that it happens for different people, to nothing really having to do with like the individual writer's work sometimes. But I think so persistence is like the number one suggestion, is that to not give up just because one agent might say it's not a fit for their list doesn't mean that it's not an excellent story and idea, that it's so subjective. But I would say to help ourselves, doing your research ahead of time. So one of the things that I did was I made like a spreadsheet with agents who I had done research on, like manuscript wish lists, for example, or also the hashtag on Twitter, MS wish list. And what agents were looking for my age category, my genre, fantasy, Also, if they said anything in their tweets about looking for something in particular, I would like a dark story or something a little scary, or I would like something to do with the Caribbean, or anything that I felt like connected to my work, I put that agent on my list. And then I looked up information about them. So had they done any interviews anywhere where they shared anything about themselves or about their interests? I looked on publishers' marketplace to see like what kinds of sales had they had, what agency were they at, if they were maybe a junior agent, were they kind of being mentored by other people? Because I think sometimes we look and say like, oh, this person's new or they don't have any sales, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not an agent that you might want to work with. It just, you'd want to make sure that their agency was well established, or that they maybe were being mentored by another agent there. So when I had that list, I think that helped me because then I sent out letters and rounds. And I had taken the advice of friends to do small batches. So I sent out 10 queries at a time. And when I heard back from someone, either positive or negative, I would, make a note on my spreadsheet, and if say someone rejected, then I would just send out the next query so that I always had 10 out. And I think that's helpful because if you get feedback from anyone, which, again, a lot of agents are busy and they get so many queries, so you might not, but I did occasionally get like personal feedback on a query. If there was something that you were hearing, you can make adjustments to your query letter, perhaps, or go back to your manuscript. If you were to get like a partial request or a full request, and maybe then not have it be offered on, you might say, okay, was there something that they said that maybe I could tweak a little bit before sending out the next batch? So I think that at least was helpful for me to be organized and do some research before. And I didn't query too early. I guess that would be my biggest piece of advice, is that as I said, I wrote my novel during NaNoWriMo, and I hear from agents sometimes is that there's a wave of queries that tend to go out like in January and February after NaNoWriMo, that people, are so excited about their manuscripts and they just send them right out. And that is probably not the best thing, because a lot of times that fast draft needs work and it needs time to sit before you come back to it with fresh eyes. And so to take your time, the agents aren't going anywhere, and to make sure it's like your absolute best before you send it out.
That's fabulous. That is your point about taking time for it to sit. Whatever you've written, in my opinion, that space really helps, because it does allow you fresh eyes, a fresh perspective. It might be a day that you need, it might be a week, depending upon what you've written. If it's a blog, maybe it's a day or an email. But if it's a manuscript, you're going to need a little bit longer than a day.
Mm-hmm.
You want more space, because that space allows you time for you to feel excited about the document when you're going back into it, but it also allows your creativity to have been percolating when you weren't working on it, because you're still working on it. It's just not in the same way. You're not actively sitting there typing or writing, but you could be doing something completely different, yet little things start to float through, and jotting them down on a notepad or in your phone and revisiting when you do sit down to revisit, those little things help. That space helps.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that I talk about with my students about reading like a writer, but I also feel like writing like a reader, is something too. So like with reading like a writer, I have my students, when you read something and like you feel an emotion, or like you really love a piece of a passage, to think about what was the writer doing there that made me feel that way. Was it, how did they, was it the dialogue? Was it something in the description? Was it like figurative language? Like, what was it? To think about like, how do you learn from the books that we read? But then I also think with writing is that if you put things aside, it gives you a little bit of a sense of being the reader. You can kind of step outside of yourself as the writer for a bit, and reading it with the eyes of somebody who's just picking up a book like you would pick up one in the library or in a bookstore to see, and gives you that moment of like, oh, like I was really in love with this opening before, but now I can see that it's confusing or it's whatever, and bring some new ideas to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you said something earlier on that I really liked how you described this, when you talked about like a sporting event, and are you the spectator or are you the player? And when you make that transition from spectating to being the player to being the writer, it's a different way of looking at the game, if you will. It's a different way of approaching what you have loved witnessing. So, do you have some recommendations for someone who's making that transition, or when they're sitting in that space and they're playing and they feel like they're not playing as well as they would like, and they thought they would do a lot better, like they almost are going, wait a minute, I think I can really do this, but I feel like I'm struggling a little bit. Can you offer some
Yeah.
encouragement there?
So my number one recommendation would be to start reading more. So I know most of people who are writers are readers, but like again, it's that idea of reading like a writer. So like whatever either genre or age category you're interested in writing for. I know I've heard before people who write picture books, they've said you should read 100 picture books, or 100 of something of whatever category that you're interested in writing. And I think that's a lot, but it's not a bad idea if you can do, just a lot more than maybe you have, like be familiar with what's current. So I think sometimes too, as writers, we have our nostalgia for books that maybe came out when we were children or a long time before. So to go to a bookstore and or a library and just pick up a bunch of books that are kind of in that area of what you're interested in writing and reading, and also paying attention to the craft that you're noticing, maybe use a notebook or use post-it notes if it's the book that you purchased yourself, or writing and highlighting what you're noticing in those books that you can learn from. And then I would say beyond that is to get into some communities of writers. If you're able to join a critique group and share your work, that's great. If you're able to, find an online class or an in-person class, there are a lot of places that like I live in a community where there's some MFA programs that let people audit classes for a really inexpensive amount of money. And I've done that before. And, just to meet other writers, to learn from other, instructors of writing, to see examples, because a lot of time in classes, they'll show like mentor texts. Here's an example of, something that has great voice, or here's an example of somebody who structured the story in an unusual way or interesting way. So that I would say, reading lots, finding communities of writers, and then just being willing to write and not expect perfection from the first draft. Let it be what it is, and that it's going to take several passes just thinking about like every time you go over it again, it's getting one step closer to where you'd like it to be, but not have any expectations on how many times that might take, because every story has its own needs.
I really love hearing that. Yeah. I mean, writers can have a tendency to get hard on themselves, in the sense of saying, this is hard. What was I thinking? Can I really do this? And so what you just described is allowing yourself to complete this piece, complete this round, and looking at this as a draft of saying, I got it done. And now I can go back and do it again with the things I've learned, the things I've observed, the feedback I've gotten, and go again. And then take another break, get more feedback if need to, do it again. So that it just, and when you get that support, when you give yourself that permission, again, another form of support, you'll get your manuscript moving and going in the direction that you want it to go, and be excited about sharing it like you are right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think even when you do those passes that I was talking about, they can be for different things. So maybe, after you've completed a first draft, I've heard, one thing that you can do is outline the story, like outline what you've already written, just to kind of see like the structure of it. So like one pass could just be on, the pacing or the structure of it. And then after you've done that, then another pass might be on the dialogue. And then after you've done that, another pass could be on, exposition and description, or whatever it is that you feel like is something that you want to check for. and that I think helps also make it manageable, because I think as even like as a teacher, like we, tell kids to focus on one thing at a time. Like you can't like, revise for everything at the same time. You have to pick something. So pick a couple of things that you're paying attention to, and then great, that's manageable. And then you can go back and look at other things in a later pass through.
Love this so, so much, Lisa. This has just been so much fun, so many nuggets of wisdom. Thank you so much. How can people connect with you and where can they get your book?
Thank you. I'm online, so I have a website, lisastringfellow.com, where you can learn more about my books, and definitely reach out to me there. I have a contact form. Also, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Engage Readers, so that kind of connects to my teaching, but I'm pretty active on both of those platforms. And my book is available in wherever books are sold. So it's on Amazon and Bookshop and your local independent bookstores.
Thank you so much. This has just been a pure joy.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.